It was a moment no one in the small town of Oak Ridge could have predicted. Tom, a kind-hearted, middle-aged waiter with a smile that could brighten anyone's day, was standing in the back of the restaurant, staring at his boss in disbelief. His manager, John, had just uttered the words that would change everything. "You're done here, Tom. Pack up your things and leave." The restaurant was unusually quiet, as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for Tom's response. He could hardly process what was happening. After more than a decade of loyal service, being known as the heart of the establishment, he was being fired. But why? What could Tom have done to deserve this? His mind raced, flashing back over the last few hours, trying to pinpoint the moment that led him to this shocking end. Tom had never thought he'd be in this position. He was one of the most dependable figures in Miller's Diner, a cozy, family-owned restaurant tucked into the corner of Main Street in Oak Ridge. The diner was more than just a place to grab a meal. It was a hub for the community, a spot where locals gathered to catch up, share stories, and feel at home. Tom, with his easygoing nature and genuine warmth, was a key part of why customers kept coming back. Oak Ridge was the kind of town where everyone knew your name, where news spread like wildfire, and where people looked out for each other. The town itself was peaceful, a mix of quaint old houses and modern shops, with wide tree-lined streets. In a place like this, where everyone knew each other's business, Tom had built a reputation. He wasn't just a waiter. He was the person who would stop by your table to chat, remember your favorite dish, and make sure you left with a smile. For Tom, it wasn't just a job. It was a calling. One of his most beloved customers was Ruth, an elderly woman in her 80s, who had been coming to Miller's Diner every Thursday afternoon for lunch for as long as anyone could remember. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the diner was buzzing with activity. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and plates clattered as Tom worked his way through the crowd of regulars and newcomers. As usual, he greeted everyone with a smile, making his rounds from table to table. Ruth had just walked in, a little later than usual, but with her usual gentle smile and slow, measured steps. Tom spotted her right away. "Good afternoon, Ruth," he called out warmly as she made her way toward her favorite table by the window. "The usual for you today." Ruth nodded, her movements slower than they had been in previous weeks. Tom noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the way she leaned more heavily on her cane. Something didn't seem right, but he didn't want to embarrass her by fussing too much. Still, his watchful eyes kept following her as he hurried back to the kitchen to place an order for another table. Just as Tom re-emerged from the kitchen, the unthinkable happened. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Ruth stumble. Her cane wobbled, slipping on the edge of the carpet near her table, and before anyone could react, she collapsed to the floor. The restaurant froze for a moment. Plates stopped clinking, conversations halted, and the lively buzz of the diner was replaced by a collective gasp. The elderly woman who had been a fixture in the restaurant for years now lay on the ground, struggling to sit up. Without a second thought, Tom rushed over to her, his heart racing. The restaurant was packed, and several tables had raised their hands to flag him down for service, but none of that mattered now. All he could think about was getting to Ruth. "Ruth, are you okay?" Tom knelt beside her, gently helping her sit up. Her face was pale, but she smiled weakly, trying to wave off the concern. "I'm fine, Tom. Just a little fall. Nothing to worry about," she whispered, but her voice trembled. She was clearly shaken. Despite Ruth's protests, Tom remained firm. "We need to get you checked out. I'm going to call for help." He signaled to one of his coworkers, Marie, who quickly grabbed the phone to call for medical assistance. As he knelt next to Ruth, Tom noticed John, the manager, glaring at him from across the room. John had been hovering near the counter, his usual irritated expression now fixed in a deep frown. He didn't move to help. In fact, he didn't even acknowledge Ruth's fall. Instead, he kept his eyes on Tom, looking angrier by the second. Once Ruth was settled into a chair with some help from Tom and Marie, the tension in the room began to dissipate. The other customers returned to their meals, murmuring quietly among themselves, but the energy in the diner had shifted. Tom was still concerned about Ruth, and though she insisted she was fine, he wasn't going to take any chances. That's when John stormed over, his face flushed with frustration. He didn't even glance at Ruth as he barked at Tom. "Tom, what the hell do you think you're doing?" John snapped. His voice was low but sharp, barely concealing his anger. "You've got tables waiting, and you're over here making a spectacle out of nothing. We don't need this kind of drama." Tom, still kneeling beside Ruth, looked up in shock. "John, she fell. She could be hurt. I'm just trying to help her." John crossed his arms, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's fine, Tom. She said it herself. There's no need to call anyone. You're overreacting, and now you're making the customers uncomfortable." Tom stood up slowly, incredulous. "Overreacting? John, she's an 80-year-old woman who just fell. What if something serious happened?" John waved his hand dismissively, his impatience clear. "She's a liability to this restaurant, Tom. She comes in here every week, moves slow, takes up space. She's bad for business. And now you're making it worse by calling attention to it." Tom's hands clenched at his sides. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Ruth is one of our most loyal customers. You really think her safety is less important than serving a few tables?" "Of course I do," John snapped back. "Your job is to serve the customers, not play nurse to some old lady who probably shouldn't even be out in public. Now get back to work, or I'll find someone who will." Before Tom could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The paramedics had arrived, responding to Marie's call. They entered the restaurant, their professional presence immediately drawing the attention of the entire room once more. Tom stayed close to Ruth as they checked her over. Even though she kept insisting that she was fine, Tom felt a wave of relief when the paramedics assured her she was in stable condition. They offered to take her to the hospital for further evaluation, but Ruth refused, politely thanking them before turning her gaze to Tom with a grateful smile. John, however, was fuming. His face had turned beet red, and as soon as the paramedics left, he pulled Tom aside, this time louder and more aggressive. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over. "This is exactly what I was talking about, Tom. You just cost us money with that little stunt. Do you know how many people are going to walk out because of the scene you just created?" Tom stared at him, stunned by his callousness. "A stunt? John, this wasn't about the restaurant's image. It's about doing the right thing. You're telling me you would have just ignored her?" John scoffed, gesturing toward the tables. "Most of these people are here for a quick lunch, not a soap opera. You think they want to sit through some overblown emergency? No, they'll go somewhere else next time." Tom could feel his pulse quicken. "So, what? You'd rather pretend like nothing happened? You'd risk her health just to keep a few customers happy?" "Damn right. I would," John spat. "You don't understand what it takes to run a business. Sometimes you have to make tough calls, and that old lady, she's not our priority. The customers are." Tom could feel the eyes of his coworkers on him, unsure whether they should step in. Marie looked torn, clearly wanting to support Tom but fearful of John's wrath. Other waitstaff hurriedly continued their work, keeping their heads down, trying to avoid the tension that now filled the diner like a heavy cloud. Tom's voice was calm but firm as he replied, "If helping someone in need is bad for business, then maybe I don't belong here." John's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Maybe you don't." With that, he stormed off, leaving Tom standing in the middle of the diner, trying to process the surreal conversation that had just taken place. He glanced over at Ruth, who was now carefully sipping her tea, seemingly oblivious to the argument that had just transpired on her behalf. Tom felt a surge of frustration and disbelief. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the restaurant only grew thicker, and Tom knew this wasn't the end of it. He had made a choice, one that would set off a chain of events he could never have anticipated. And so, what had started as an ordinary day in the small town of Oak Ridge had suddenly turned into a confrontation that would shake the entire community. Tom had always prided himself on doing the right thing, but he had no idea just how much that decision was going to cost him. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze for Tom. Though he tried to focus on his remaining tables, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was looming. His heart raced every time John walked past him, each glance colder than the last. The incident with Ruth was still fresh in his mind, and the tension in the diner remained thick enough to cut with a knife. Just as Tom was finishing up his shift, clearing the last table of the day, John appeared again, this time with a look of finality in his eyes. Without a word, he gestured for Tom to follow him to the back office. Tom's stomach twisted in knots as he walked behind John, knowing full well that this wasn't going to be a simple conversation about the incident. Inside the cramped, windowless office, John closed the door behind them and leaned against his desk, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Tom stood there, waiting for the reprimand he knew was coming, but instead, John wasted no time getting to the point. "You're fired, Tom," John said bluntly, the words falling like a hammer in the silent room. Tom blinked, stunned. For a moment, he thought he hadn't heard correctly. "What?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, struggling to process the reality of what was happening. "Fired? For what?" John's eyes narrowed as he spoke, his voice cold and devoid of any sympathy. "For causing a scene, Tom. For putting this restaurant at risk. You overstepped today, and it's going to cost us. You've embarrassed me, disrupted the flow of business, and now people are talking. Do you know what kind of damage this could do?" Tom's confusion quickly turned to anger. "Damage? I helped an elderly woman who fell. That's not causing a scene. That's doing the right thing. How can you fire me for that?" John stood up, towering over Tom, his face turning red with fury. "Doing the right thing? You caused a disruption. You called paramedics, and now the whole town's going to think we're some kind of liability. Do you understand what you've done to our reputation? People will start questioning if it's safe to even come here. You put Ruth's fall on display for everyone to see. Now, all they'll talk about is how dangerous it is to eat here." Tom couldn't believe what he was hearing. "John, you're overreacting. This isn't about our reputation. This is about a person's safety. Ruth could have been seriously hurt, and you want to sweep it under the rug." "That's exactly what we should have done," John snapped. "It's bad for business, Tom. You made us look like we don't know how to run a clean, safe establishment. That's going to hurt the bottom line, and I can't have that." Tom stared at John, his mind racing. He had known John to be tough, but this level of callousness shocked him. He had worked at the diner for over a decade, pouring his heart into the place, treating every customer like family. And now, because he had chosen to help someone in need, he was being shown the door. After all these years, Tom's voice cracked as he spoke, disbelief flooding his words. "After everything I've done for this place, you're firing me because I cared about Ruth's safety more than a few dollars." John didn't flinch. "This is business, Tom. I can't afford liabilities. You crossed a line, and now you're paying the price. Pack your things." Tom stood there in stunned silence for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. He wanted to lash out, to argue, to plead his case, but deep down, he knew there was no point. John's decision had been made. The reality of it hit Tom like a punch to the gut. Slowly, the shock began to melt away, replaced by something else. It wasn't anger, it was a quiet resolve. Tom looked John square in the eye, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'm not sorry for what I did," Tom said. "If helping Ruth cost me my job, then so be it. I'd rather lose this job than stand by and do nothing when someone's in need." John rolled his eyes, turning away from Tom dismissively. "Save the moral speeches, Tom. This isn't about heroism. You made a bad call, and now you're out. Simple as that." Tom didn't respond. Without another word, he turned and left the office, his steps heavy as he walked down the hallway toward the employee break room. He couldn't believe this was happening. As he packed his locker, the weight of the moment pressed down on him, a mixture of disbelief, sadness, and a touch of righteous anger. His coworkers watched in silence, casting sympathetic glances his way but saying nothing. Tom knew they were scared, scared to speak up, scared to side with him, scared to risk their own jobs. He couldn't blame them, but it still stung to feel so alone in that moment. As he packed the last of his things into a small box, he glanced around the break room one final time, the memories of years of service flooding his mind. He had built relationships here, friendships that spanned the town. He had poured his heart into his work, always going the extra mile for customers. Now, it all felt like a bitter aftertaste. But despite the sting of betrayal, Tom knew he had made the right choice. He had stood up for what he believed in, even if it cost him his livelihood. The news spread through Oak Ridge faster than Tom could have imagined. By the time he arrived home that evening, his phone was buzzing with messages from friends, customers, and acquaintances, all asking the same question. Is it true? Word had gotten out. Tom had been fired for helping Ruth after her fall. The town, known for its tight-knit community and love for its people, was outrage. How could Miller's Diner fire the very person who had been its heart and soul for years? The whispers turned into conversations, and soon, conversations turned into action. The next day, the diner's regulars began to stay away. People who had come to know and love Tom, who appreciated his kindness, who looked forward to his warm greetings, decided they couldn't support a place that would fire someone for doing the right thing. A quiet boycott began. The diner, once bustling with customers during lunch and dinner hours, was eerily empty. The tables that Tom used to serve were left vacant, and the waitstaff, still reeling from the shock of his firing, served fewer and fewer meals each day. Meanwhile, Ruth was devastated. She felt responsible for what had happened to Tom and tried to speak with John to convince him to take Tom back. But John, stubborn and prideful, refused to even hear her out. His decision was final. Just as the weight of losing his job began to settle in, Tom's phone rang late one evening. It was Steve, an old friend he hadn't spoken to in a while. Steve had heard about what happened through the Oak Ridge grapevine and had something unexpected to offer. "Tom, I heard about what went down at the diner," Steve said. "It's crazy, man. But listen, I've got a catering business that's picking up steam, and I could use someone like you. How'd you feel about helping me out for a bit?" Tom was speechless. He hadn't even thought about what his next step would be. The shock of being fired had clouded his mind, and now here was a new opportunity being handed to him from an old friend. Steve's offer wasn't just a temporary lifeline. It was a chance for something bigger, something better. Tom smiled as he realized that maybe, just maybe, losing his job at the diner wasn't the end of the road, but the beginning of a new one. Tom sat at his kitchen table, staring at the phone in his hand. Steve's offer still echoed in his mind, swirling around with a mix of emotions. He was hesitant, unsure if jumping into something new so soon was the right move, especially after what had just happened at Miller's Diner. The sting of losing his job, not because of any mistake or incompetence, but for doing what he believed was right, still gnawed at him. It was hard to shake the betrayal. But then again, what other choice did he have? Steve had always been a good friend, reliable, straight-shooting, and supportive. His catering business had grown steadily over the years, and now he was in need of someone trustworthy to help with a big upcoming event. The job was temporary, at first, but Steve hinted that if things went well, it could turn into something more, a partnership even. It was tempting, more tempting than Tom wanted to admit. After all, he loved the restaurant business, and Steve's offer could open a new door for him, one that could lead to something far bigger than he had ever imagined while working at Miller's Diner. The next morning, Tom made his decision. He picked up the phone and called Steve. "I'm in," Tom said, feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement. When do we start?" Steve's voice lit up with enthusiasm. "Great. I've got this massive corporate event coming up in 2 weeks, and I could really use your help. I think you're gonna love it, Tom. Let's meet tomorrow and go over the details." With that, Tom had officially taken the first step toward something new, though he had no idea just how life-changing this opportunity would become. His days quickly became filled with planning, coordinating menus, and organizing staff with Steve. It was hard work, but Tom found joy in it, realizing how much he missed the camaraderie and the satisfaction of creating something from scratch. And it wasn't long before word got out that Tom had joined forces with Steve's catering business. Meanwhile, things were not going so well at Miller's Diner. The once bustling eatery, filled with the hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes, had grown eerily quiet. The diner, which had thrived on regular customers, people who had come to know and love Tom's warm greetings and attentive service, was now struggling to fill its tables. The fallout from firing Tom was swift. Regulars stopped coming in, refusing to support a place that had mistreated one of their own. Oak Ridge was a town that valued loyalty and kindness, and the way John had fired Tom for simply helping an elderly customer didn't sit well with anyone. The news had spread like wildfire, and in a community where reputation meant everything, the restaurant's name became tainted. John, in his stubbornness, tried to brush off the downturn at first. He assumed it would blow over, that customers would come back once the drama faded. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that this wasn't a temporary dip. Sales plummeted, and the rumor mill only made things worse. People began talking about how John had neglected the upkeep of the restaurant, including the loose tiles on the floor that had caused Ruth's fall in the first place. The whispers of negligence grew louder, and the once beloved diner began to lose its shine. John, frustrated and desperate, considered offering discounts, revamping the menu, and even throwing around the idea of a rebranding. But none of these tactics worked. His pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge that the real reason people were staying away was because of how he had treated Tom. Apologizing to Tom or asking him to come back was out of the question in John's mind. His pride was too great, and he wasn't willing to admit that he had made a mistake. While the diner floundered, Tom's life began to take an unexpected turn. Steve's catering business was booming, and the two of them quickly formed a powerful team. Their first event together, a massive corporate gala, was a resounding success. Tom's experience in the restaurant business, combined with Steve's entrepreneurial spirit, made them a perfect pair. Tom's attention to detail, customer service, and his ability to handle high-pressure situations shone through, impressing not only Steve, but also their clients. Word of Tom's new role spread quickly throughout Oak Ridge. Many of the same people who had once been regulars at Miller's Diner started reaching out to Steve for catering, specifically asking for Tom to be involved. Some even stopped by their events just to show their support for Tom, letting him know that they stood by him and appreciated his integrity. Before long, what had started as a temporary gig turned into something much more permanent. Steve, impressed by Tom's work ethic and how well they worked together, offered him a partnership in the business. It was an offer that Tom hadn't expected, but one that he couldn't refuse. The two friends officially became business partners, and together, they expanded the catering company, adding new services and reaching even more clients. The community's support was overwhelming. People valued Tom not just for his skill, but for his character. He had stood up for Ruth when no one else would, and that meant something to them. As Miller's Diner continued to decline, Tom's new venture flourished. It was as if karma had swung in his favor, rewarding him for doing the right thing, even at great personal cost. Just as Tom was beginning to settle into his new role, feeling like things were finally on an upward trajectory, he received a phone call that would shake things up once again. "Hello, is this Tom?" The voice on the other end of the line asked. "Yes, this is Tom." "Who's calling?" he replied, curiosity piqued. "This is Laura Davies, Ruth's lawyer. I wanted to inform you that Ruth has filed a lawsuit against Miller's Diner for negligence related to her fall. We're claiming that the diner's failure to maintain the flooring led to her accident. As someone who witnessed the incident and helped her, we would like you to testify as a key witness in the case." Tom sat in stunned silence for a moment. A lawsuit? He hadn't expected this. Though he knew Ruth had been upset over the way things had turned out, he hadn't realized she was planning to take legal action. "Of course," Tom said, finally finding his voice. "I'd be happy to testify. I saw everything that happened." "Thank you, Tom," Laura replied. "Your testimony could make a huge difference in this case. We're hoping for a fair outcome for Ruth, but the restaurant will likely push back hard. Be prepared for a tough fight." After the call ended, Tom couldn't help but feel a surge of mixed emotions. Part of him felt vindicated. If Miller's Diner was found liable for Ruth's fall, it would validate everything he had stood up for. But another part of him felt conflicted. Oak Ridge was a small town, and this lawsuit would undoubtedly stir up even more drama. Still, Tom knew one thing for sure. He had done the right thing then, and he would continue to do the right thing now. He had stood up for Ruth when it mattered most, and he wouldn't back down now. Karma, it seemed, wasn't done with Miller's Diner just yet. As Tom prepared for the legal battle ahead, he couldn't help but marvel at how much his life had changed in such a short time. What had once seemed like a devastating blow, losing his job at the diner, had turned into an opportunity for something far greater. And now, as the town watched the events unfold, one thing was clear. The truth was about to come to light, and Tom was ready to face whatever came next. The lawsuit between Ruth and Miller's Diner quickly became the talk of Oak Ridge. The small town, known for its close-knit community and quiet streets, was suddenly abuzz with conversation. Everyone had an opinion, and many saw the trial not just as a legal battle, but as a moral showdown. A clash between a kind-hearted man who had been wronged for doing the right thing and a greedy business owner who valued profit over people. The courtroom was packed from the very first day, with town residents eager to see how the drama would unfold. Tom had never been involved in anything like this before. He wasn't one for drama, preferring to go about his life without stirring up conflict. But now, standing in front of the courtroom, with all eyes on him, he realized just how much was riding on his testimony. Ruth, sitting in the front row with her lawyer, gave him a small, encouraging smile as he approached the witness stand. She looked frailer than ever, but there was a fire in her eyes, a determination that Tom had rarely seen before. The judge, a stern-looking woman who had presided over many local disputes, called the court to order. John sat across the room at the defendant's table, his face hard and unreadable. He hadn't looked at Tom once since the trial began. His lawyer was known to be sharp and aggressive, and Tom knew he was in for a grilling. When it was time for Tom to testify, he took a deep breath and began recounting the events of that fateful day. His voice was steady as he described every detail, from how Ruth had entered the diner to the moment she fell, how he rushed to her side, and how John had reacted afterward. As he spoke, the courtroom remained silent, hanging on to every word. "I helped Ruth to her feet," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. "And when I saw she was shaken, I insisted we call for medical help. That's when John came over. He didn't care about Ruth's well-being. All he was concerned about was how it looked to the other customers." John's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation." The judge raised her hand to quiet the room. "Sustained. Mr. Tom, please stick to the facts." Tom nodded. "The fact is, John told me that Ruth was bad for business, and that I shouldn't have made a scene. He was more worried about the restaurant's image than Ruth's safety." The courtroom murmured, but the judge quickly silenced the crowd with a sharp glance. Tom felt the weight of the moment, knowing his words carried not just the truth but the heart of the case. He continued, detailing how the paramedics had been called, how Ruth had refused to go to the hospital, and how John had berated him in the back office later that day. When Tom finished his testimony, Ruth's lawyer thanked him and sat down. John's lawyer, sensing an opportunity to shift the narrative, approached Tom with a smug look. He began cross-examining Tom, trying to poke holes in his story, questioning his motives, and suggesting that perhaps Tom had overreacted to the situation. But Tom remained unshaken. He knew the truth, and he wasn't about to let anyone twist it. As the trial progressed, it seemed like it could go either way. John's lawyer had done a decent job of casting doubt, but Ruth's legal team was prepared with evidence that would turn the tide decisively in her favor. Then came the moment that changed everything. Ruth's lawyer stood up and presented a piece of evidence that had been meticulously gathered: a maintenance report from Miller's Diner. The report showed that several weeks before Ruth's fall, the diner's floor had been flagged for repair by an employee who had noticed that some of the tiles near the entrance were loose and unstable. That employee had brought the issue to John's attention, but nothing had been done. The courtroom was stunned into silence as the report was read aloud. The loose tile, the one that had caused Ruth to trip, had been a known hazard for weeks, maybe even months before her fall. John's negligence, his refusal to address a simple maintenance issue, was the real cause of the accident. John's lawyer fumbled, trying to counter the evidence, but the damage had been done. The revelation that John had knowingly ignored a safety hazard was a devastating blow to his defense. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of disbelief and anger, and Tom felt a surge of vindication as he looked over at Ruth, who now had tears in her eyes. After days of testimony, the jury finally returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the decision. Ruth had won the case. The jury had found Miller's Diner guilty of negligence, and Ruth was awarded a substantial amount in compensation for her injuries. The court also imposed fines on the restaurant for failing to maintain safe conditions and, in a rare move, ordered John to publicly apologize to Ruth and the community for his actions. The moment the verdict was announced, Tom felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Justice had been served, not just for Ruth, but for everyone who had felt betrayed by the way John had run his business. The town had come together to support the truth, and in the end, they had prevailed. John, however, looked like a broken man. His once proud demeanor had crumbled, and he sat at the defendant's table, staring blankly ahead. The public apology he was forced to give was painful to watch. His voice was flat and hollow as he stood in front of the court, and the people of Oak Ridge, admitting his wrongdoing. "I'm sorry," John mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I should have done better. I was wrong." But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the town had already moved on. John's reputation, and that of Miller's Diner, was beyond repair. In the days following the trial, it became clear that Miller's Diner wouldn't survive. The fines and compensation payoffs were crippling, and the restaurant's already tarnished reputation had been completely destroyed by the trial. Customers who had once been loyal to the diner now refused to step foot inside, and the few who did quickly realized that the atmosphere had changed. The warmth that Tom had brought to the place was gone, replaced by a sense of emptiness and loss. John, seeing his business crumbling before his eyes, was desperate. With no other options left, he did the unthinkable. He reached out to Tom. Tom received a message from John one afternoon, asking to meet for coffee. Out of curiosity and perhaps a sense of closure, Tom agreed. They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, far away from the diner. John looked like a shadow of his former self, his once sharp appearance now disheveled and tired. "Tom," John began, his voice low, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have fired you. I shouldn't have treated Ruth the way I did. I've lost everything because of it. The diner. It's finished." Tom listened in silence, waiting for John to get to the point. "I need your help," John continued. "I can't turn things around on my own. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about how I ran the diner. If you come back, we can rebuild it together. People still trust you. They still believe in you." For a moment, Tom considered it. The diner had been a huge part of his life for so many years. But then he thought about Steve, their growing catering business, and how far he had come since the day he was fired. He thought about how the town had rallied behind him, and how he had found something better, something that aligned with his values. Tom shook his head gently. "I appreciate the offer, John, but I've moved on. I'm doing something that matters to me now, something I believe in. I can't go back." John nodded, a defeated look in his eyes. "I understand." With that, they parted ways, and Tom walked away with a sense of finality. The chapter of his life that had begun at Miller's Diner had officially closed. Karma, it seemed, had come full circle. As Tom returned to his new venture with Steve, he felt more at peace than he had in months. The town continued to support him, and their catering business flourished, expanding beyond Oak Ridge to nearby cities. Tom had found success, not by cutting corners or putting profits first, but by staying true to who he was and what he believed in. In the end, doing the right thing had led him exactly where he needed to be. Months after the trial, Tom's life had transformed in ways he never imagined. What began as a temporary role in Steve's catering business had blossomed into a full-fledged partnership. Together, Tom and Steve didn't just expand their catering services. They took the bold step of opening their own restaurant. It wasn't just any restaurant, though. They envisioned a place that embodied everything Tom stood for: kindness, community, and exceptional service. It would be a place where every customer, no matter who they were, felt valued. The restaurant, aptly named the Oak Ridge Table, became an instant hit. Nestled in the heart of the town, it was more than just a place to eat. It was a reflection of the values that had brought the community together during the tumultuous trial. From the moment the doors opened, people could feel the difference. Tom's signature warmth infused every interaction, and Steve's sharp business acumen ensured everything ran smoothly. Ruth was one of the first customers through the door on opening day. She arrived with her cane in hand, greeted like an old friend by Tom, who personally escorted her to her table, now reserved for her every Thursday. "Feels like home," Ruth said softly, smiling at Tom as she sipped her tea. Word spread quickly about the Oak Ridge Table, and soon it became the town's new gathering spot. Families, friends, and even people from neighboring towns came not just for the food, but for the sense of belonging. Tom had built more than a restaurant. He had built a community. People flocked to support him, drawn by the story of how he had stood up for what was right, and how his integrity had led him to something even greater. The restaurant emphasized local produce, employed people from the community, and even held charity events, supporting causes close to Tom's heart. The values of integrity, kindness, and community were etched into every part of the business. It was a reminder to all who visited that success doesn't have to come at the expense of one's principles. While the Oak Ridge Table thrived, John's restaurant, Miller's Diner, had met a very different fate. After the trial, the diner never recovered from the blow to its reputation. The once bustling eatery that had been a staple in Oak Ridge for years was now a shell of its former self. The bad press surrounding Ruth's fall, compounded by the lawsuit and John's public apology, had driven away most of the diner's regulars. The few remaining customers couldn't sustain the business, and as weeks passed, the diner's revenue plummeted. John tried everything to salvage the diner: special promotions, new menu items, even a rebranding effort, but none of it worked. The trust had been broken, and in a small town like Oak Ridge, reputation meant everything. People couldn't forget how Tom had been treated, and they certainly couldn't forget the neglect that had caused Ruth's injury. The community had made its choice, and they chose to support those who valued people over profits. After months of struggling to stay afloat, Miller's Diner finally closed its doors for good. The once bright neon sign that had lit up Main Street was turned off for the last time, and the building was put up for sale. It wasn't long before a new family business moved in, a cafe run by a young couple looking to start fresh. They repainted the building, gave it a new name, and brought new life to the space. It was a bittersweet end, marking the close of a chapter in Oak Ridge's history, but the town had already moved on to a brighter, more hopeful future. The events surrounding Tom's firing, Ruth's fall, and the trial left a lasting impact on Oak Ridge. As the dust settled, the town began to reflect on everything that had happened. Conversations over coffee or during chance meetings in the town square inevitably turned to the story that had unfolded. It became a touchstone for broader discussions about integrity, standing up for what's right, and the importance of community. Many saw the saga as a reminder that doing the right thing isn't always easy, and it certainly isn't always profitable in the short term. But as Tom's story showed, sticking to one's principles can lead to a deeper kind of success. The town's residents were proud of how they had rallied around Tom, choosing to support someone who had demonstrated courage and compassion in the face of adversity. People spoke often of how Tom's quiet heroism had reminded them of what truly matters: taking care of each other, especially the most vulnerable among them. Ruth's story became a symbol of that shared responsibility. She had been treated as bad for business by John, but Tom had seen her as a human being worthy of care and respect. That choice had cost him his job, but ultimately led him to something far greater. In local schools, teachers used the story as a lesson for students. Discussions about moral courage, empathy, and standing up against injustice became common, with Tom's actions serving as a real-life example. His story had transcended the walls of the courtroom and the restaurant, becoming a part of the town's collective memory and identity. Karma had indeed come full circle in Oak Ridge. John, once a prominent business owner, had been brought low by his own actions, while Tom, who had lost everything, found a new path paved by his integrity and the support of the community. The two men's fates could not have diverged more drastically. In the end, Tom had won not just the battle for Ruth's safety, but the respect and admiration of the town. The Oak Ridge table flourished in ways that Miller's Diner never could, because it wasn't just a business. It was a reflection of Tom's values. It became a symbol of what could happen when you choose people over profits and community over competition. Tom risked everything to do what was right. He could have stayed silent and kept his job, but he chose to help Ruth, even at great personal cost. In the end, his courage and integrity led him to a new life filled with success and purpose. But what about you? What would you have done in Tom's shoes? Would you risk everything to stand up for what's right, even if it meant losing something important? Share your thoughts in the comments below.